When Mary Sullivan clutched her last dime in 1885 Chicago, she faced an impossible choice: watch her baby die of pneumonia or sell the only thing she had left, herself. The gentleman who answered her desperate plea shocked her by offering something she'd never expected from a stranger: unconditional kindness that would change everything. But when her past returns to claim what it believes it owns, will Mary choose the safety of familiar chains or the terrifying freedom of true love? Emma's cries cut through the winter air like broken glass. Mary Sullivan pressed her ear against the thin wooden door of their tiny room, listening for footsteps in the hallway. Mrs. Peterson from next door had already complained twice this week about the noise. One more complaint would mean eviction, and February in Chicago was no time to be living on the streets with a sick baby. The room felt like an icebox. Mary could see her breath when she spoke, and frost covered the inside of their single window. She had stuffed old newspapers into every crack in the walls, but the cold still crept in like an unwelcome visitor that refused to leave. Emma lay on a pile of thin blankets, her tiny face red and hot with fever. Her breathing sounded rough and scary, like sandpaper scraping against wood. Mary had heard that sound before when her own mother had gotten sick years ago. It meant pneumonia, and pneumonia could kill a baby in just a few days. "Shoo, sweet girl," Mary whispered, picking up her daughter. Emma's body felt like a little furnace, burning up from the inside. "Mama's here. Everything will be okay." But Mary knew she was lying. Nothing was okay. Nothing had been okay since James left 3 months ago, chasing dreams of gold in California. He had kissed her goodbye and promised to send money, but no letters had come. No money either. Mary walked to the window and looked down at the busy street below. Horse-drawn carriages splashed through muddy puddles, carrying well-dressed people to warm houses and hot meals. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and wondered what it felt like to never worry about where your next meal would come from. Her stomach made a loud rumbling sound. She had eaten only a small piece of stale bread yesterday, saving the rest for today. But Emma needed milk, and Mary's body wasn't making enough because she was too hungry and tired. The baby's crying got louder. Mary bounced her gently, humming a song her own mother used to sing. But Emma wouldn't calm down. Her little hands felt like tiny hot coals against Mary's neck. A sharp knock on the door made Mary's heart jump. She froze, hoping whoever it was would go away. But the knocking came again, harder this time. "Mrs. Sullivan?" It was Mrs. Henderson, the landlady. Her voice sounded tired and annoyed. "Open this door. We need to talk." Mary's hands shook as she unlocked the door. Mrs. Henderson stood in the hallway holding a piece of paper. She was a large woman with gray hair pulled back tight, and her face always looked like she had just smelled something bad. "You're behind on rent," Mrs. Henderson said, not bothering with polite greetings. 3 weeks now? That's $9 you owe me." $9 might as well have been 900. Mary only had 37 cents to her name, hidden in a crack in the floorboard under Emma's makeshift bed. "Please," Mary said quietly. "Just a little more time. I'm looking for work." "What kind of work?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed. "No decent family wants to hire a woman with a crying baby. And look at you." She waved her hand up and down at Mary's appearance. "Your dress has holes, your shoes are falling apart, and you're skinny as a rail. Who would trust you to clean their house or cook their food?" The words stung because they were true. Mary's only good dress had been sold weeks ago to buy food. The dress she wore now had belonged to James's mother, and it was too big and too old. Her shoes had holes that let in the cold and wet, and her hair hadn't been properly washed in over a week. "I'll find something," Mary insisted, but even she didn't believe it anymore. Mrs. Henderson looked at Emma, who was still crying weakly in Mary's arms. For a moment, her expression softened just a little. "The baby's sick. She has a fever. I think it might be pneumonia. Dr. Williams lives 2 blocks over. He's expensive, but he's good with children." Mary's heart sank. If Dr. Williams was expensive, she couldn't afford him. How expensive? $2 for a house call. More if she needs special medicine. $2. Mary felt like crying herself. She might as well ask for the moon. Mrs. Henderson sighed heavily. "Look, Mrs. Sullivan, I'm not a heartless woman. I have children of my own. But I can't run a business on sympathy. Other tenants are complaining about the noise, and I have bills to pay too. How long do I have?" 3 days. If you can't pay by Friday, you'll have to leave." After Mrs. Henderson left, Mary sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. 3 days. Emma's breathing was getting worse, and winter was getting colder. If they were put out on the street, they would both be dead within a week. She thought about writing a letter to James in California, begging him to send money. But even if he got the letter and decided to help, it would take weeks for any money to arrive. Emma didn't have weeks. Mary walked to the cracked mirror hanging on the wall and looked at herself. Mrs. Henderson was right, she looked terrible. But underneath the tiredness and hunger, she was still young. Only 22 years old. Some men might find her pretty if she cleaned up a little. The thought made her stomach twist with shame, but it wouldn't go away. She had heard whispers about women who sold themselves to men for money. It was considered the worst thing a woman could do, but those women usually had enough money for food and rent. No, she said out loud to her reflection. I won't do that. There has to be another way. But as Emma's coughing fit started again, Mary wondered if there really was another way. She was running out of time, running out of options, and running out of hope. She walked to the window again and watched the street below. A well-dressed man in a fine coat was helping a lady into a carriage. The lady was laughing at something he said, and she looked warm and happy and safe. Mary pressed her forehead against the cold glass. What would it be like to feel safe again? To know that Emma would have medicine when she needed it, food when she was hungry, warm clothes when it was cold? I'm a good mother, she whispered to the empty room. This doesn't make me a bad mother. But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. Good mothers didn't think about selling themselves. Good mothers found other ways to take care of their children. Emma's crying had stopped, but not because she felt better. She had simply gotten too weak to cry anymore. Her little chest moved up and down fast, like a bird's heart beating. Mary knew she was running out of time to make a decision. By tomorrow, Emma might be too sick for any medicine to help. By Friday, they would be homeless. She walked to the floorboard where she had hidden her last few coins and pulled them out. 37 cents. Not enough for medicine, not enough for rent, barely enough for a loaf of bread. But maybe enough for paper and ink to write a note. A note that would change everything, one way or another. The morning sun painted long shadows across the boarding house's front steps as Mary stood frozen with a piece of paper in her trembling hand. She had written and rewritten the note 5 times, but the words still felt wrong in her mouth when she tried to read them out loud. Young woman seeks gentleman companion for evening employment. Inquire at room 3B between noon and 3 o'clock. The words made her feel sick, but Emma's raspy breathing from upstairs made her feel sicker. Her daughter had barely slept all night, and this morning she wouldn't even take the sugar water Mary had tried to give her. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived on the first floor, came out to sweep her front step. She glanced at Mary with curious eyes. Morning, dear, Mrs. Patterson said kindly. You're up early. Yes, ma'am. Mary quickly folded the paper and hid it behind her back. Mrs. Patterson was one of the few tenants who had always been nice to her, and Mary couldn't bear the thought of losing that kindness. How's your little one? I heard her coughing last night. She's not well. Mary's voice cracked. I'm trying to find work so I can afford a doctor. Mrs. Patterson stopped sweeping and looked at Mary more carefully. What kind of work are you looking for? For a wild moment, Mary almost told her the truth. Mrs. Patterson had kind eyes and a gentle voice. Maybe she would understand. Maybe she would even help. But then Mary imagined those kind eyes filling with shock and disgust. She imagined Mrs. Patterson stepping away from her, crossing herself, telling everyone in the building what Mary Sullivan was really planning to do. Cleaning work, Mary lied. Washing clothes. Anything honest. Mrs. Patterson nodded sympathetically. Times are hard for everyone, especially women on their own. I'll ask around, see if anyone needs help. Thank you, Mary whispered, feeling the weight of her lie settle in her stomach like a stone. After Mrs. Patterson went back inside, Mary walked to the message board near the front door. Other people had posted notes here before, someone looking for a lost cat, someone selling a used coat, someone offering to teach piano lessons. Mary's note would look just like theirs, at least on the surface. But anyone who knew how to read between the lines would understand what she was really offering. Her hands shook as she pinned the note to the board. Once it was up, there would be no taking it back. People would see it and word would spread. By evening, everyone in the neighborhood would know that Mary Sullivan had fallen as low as a woman could fall. But Emma was dying and nothing else mattered. Mrs. Sullivan? Mary spun around, her heart hammering. A young man stood behind her, holding a cap in his hands. He looked nervous and embarrassed. Are you the lady looking for work? He asked quietly. Mary's mouth went dry. She had expected her first response to come from someone older, someone who looked more dangerous. This boy couldn't be more than 17, with a face full of freckles and eyes that reminded her of her younger brother. Yes, she managed to say. The boy shifted his weight from foot to foot. My name's Tommy. Tommy O'Brien. I work at the blacksmith shop down the street. Mary waited for him to continue, but he just stood there looking at the ground. What kind of work do you need done? Mary asked, though she was pretty sure she already knew. Tommy's face turned bright red. Well, see, there's this girl I like. Sarah McKenna. She works at the bakery. But I don't know how to talk to girls, and I thought maybe. He trailed off, looking miserable. Mary blinked in confusion. You want me to help you talk to a girl? You seem nice, Tommy said hopefully. And you're a lady, so you'd know what girls like to hear. I could pay you a quarter if you'd teach me what to say. Relief flooded through Mary so fast she almost laughed. This sweet boy wasn't looking for the kind of company she had been prepared to sell. He just wanted help with his sweetheart. I'd be happy to help you, she said warmly. But I need to check on my baby first. Can you come back this afternoon? Tommy's face lit up. Really? You'll help me. Of course. As Tommy hurried away, Mary felt a spark of hope. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe she could find honest work after all, helping people with small problems instead of selling herself for money. But when she got back to her room, Emma was worse. Her skin felt burning hot and her breathing sounded wet and terrible. Mary tried to give her water, but Emma was too weak to swallow. Please, baby girl, Mary whispered. Just hold on a little longer. There was another knock at the door. Mary opened it to find a well-dressed woman standing in the hallway. She was probably 40 years old with expensive clothes and carefully arranged hair. Are you the woman looking for work? The lady asked in a crisp voice. Yes, ma'am. The woman looked Mary up and down with sharp eyes. I'm Mrs. Bradford. I need someone to clean my house twice a week. The pay is 50 cents each time. Mary's heart leaped. $1 a week was real money, enough to buy food and maybe even save up for a doctor. I'd be very interested, Mary said quickly. Mrs. Bradford stepped into the room without being invited. Her nose wrinkled at the smell of sickness and poverty. Her eyes took in the thin blankets, the cracked walls, the tiny space where Mary and Emma lived. You have a baby, Mrs. Bradford observed, looking at Emma with distaste. Yes, ma'am. But she's usually very quiet and I could bring her with me. Absolutely not. Mrs. Bradford's voice was sharp. I run a respectable household. I can't have a crying infant disturbing my family. She won't cry, Mary said desperately. She's sick right now, but once she's better. Sick? Mrs. Bradford stepped backward quickly. What kind of sick? Just a cold, Mary lied. Nothing serious. But Mrs. Bradford was already heading for the door. I'm sorry, but I need someone who can work without distractions. Someone without complications. After she left, Mary sat down heavily on the bed. Emma made a small whimpering sound and Mary picked her up carefully. Her daughter felt lighter than she had yesterday, as if the sickness was burning her up from the inside. The afternoon brought 2 more visitors. The first was an older man who took one look at Mary's shabby dress and sick baby and decided he needed someone more professional. The second was a woman who offered Mary work as a seamstress, but only if she could work 12 hours a day in a stuffy room across town. There was no way Mary could leave Emma alone for that long, especially when she was so sick. As the sun began to set, Mary realized her plan wasn't working. People saw her poverty, her sick child, her desperation, and they wanted nothing to do with her. Even honest work seemed impossible to find. She was sitting by the window, holding Emma and watching the street below when she saw a man in a dark coat reading her note on the message board. He stood there for a long time, studying the paper carefully. Mary's heart started beating faster. This man was different from the others. He was older, maybe 40, with gray streaks in his dark hair. His clothes were nice but not fancy, and there was something gentle about the way he moved. He looked up at the windows of the boarding house as if trying to figure out which room was 3B. Mary ducked away from the window, her hands shaking. This was it. This was what she had been waiting for all day, a man who understood what her note really meant. But now that the moment was here, Mary wasn't sure she could go through with it. This stranger would expect her to do things she had never done with anyone except James. He would expect her to pretend she enjoyed it, to act like she was the kind of woman who sold herself for money. Emma made a soft sound and Mary looked down at her daughter's flushed face. In the fading light, Emma looked so small and fragile, like a flower that might blow away in the next strong wind. Mary closed her eyes and tried to imagine what James would say if he knew what she was about to do. He would be angry, probably. Disgusted. He might never forgive her, even if he did come back from California. But James wasn't here. He wasn't watching Emma struggle to breathe. He wasn't listening to her weak cries or feeling her burning fever. Mary was alone and Emma was dying, and sometimes being alone meant making choices that no one else would understand. There was a soft knock at the door. A man in expensive clothes sat alone in the darkest corner of Flanagan Tavern, and Mary's heart pounded so hard she thought everyone could hear it. The smoky air made her eyes water as she stepped inside, but she couldn't tell if the tears came from the smoke or from what she was about to do. "You looking for someone, miss?" The bartender's voice cut through the noise like a knife through butter. Mary's mouth felt dry as sand. "The gentleman in the blue coat." The big man behind the bar looked her up and down, then shook his head slowly. "You sure about this, girl? You don't look like his usual type." What did that mean? Mary wondered, but she was too scared to ask. Instead, she walked toward the corner table on shaking legs, each step feeling like she was walking toward the edge of a cliff. The man looked up as she approached, and Mary's first thought surprised her. His eyes weren't mean or hungry like she'd expected. They looked sad, like someone had taken something precious away from him and he was still looking for it. "Mr. Whitmore?" she whispered. He stood up quickly, almost knocking over his chair. "Mrs. Sullivan, please sit down." Mary remained standing, gripping her thin shawl so tight her knuckles turned white. "I should tell you something first. I've never done anything like this before. I don't know how these things work." Thomas Whitmore studied her face for a long moment. His hair was gray at the sides, and he had the kind of hands that looked like they'd held books more than hammers. "Tell me about your baby." The question hit Mary like a surprise slap. She'd practiced what she thought he might ask, but not this. "Her name is Emma. She's 8 months old." The words started slow, then rushed out like water through a broken dam. "She can't breathe right. The doctor says it's pneumonia. He wants $2 for the medicine, but I don't have $2. I don't have anything." "What happened to your husband?" Mary's cheeks burned hot. "He left. Said California had gold and Chicago only had problems." She looked down at her worn boots. "I guess I was one of the problems." Thomas was quiet for so long that Mary finally looked up. He was turning a gold ring around and around on his finger like he was trying to decide something important. "My wife died 2 years ago," he said finally. His voice sounded like it hurt to say the words. "Same sickness as your baby. I had all the money in the world for doctors and medicine, but it didn't help. I sat by her bed every day watching her get weaker and weaker." Mary felt her throat tighten. "I'm sorry. I couldn't save her." Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out 3 silver coins. They caught the lamplight and seemed to glow. "But maybe I can save someone else." Mary stared at the money like it might disappear if she blinked. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing." "Nothing?" Mary's voice came out like a squeak. "But I thought. I mean, why else would you?" Thomas pushed the coins across the table toward her. "Take them. Buy the medicine. Feed your baby." Mary's hands shook as she reached for the money, then stopped. "This doesn't make sense. Men don't give away money for nothing." "Some men do." Thomas's smile was small but real. "Some men remember what it felt like to be helpless. Some men want to do something good before they die." "Are you dying?" The question popped out before Mary could stop it. Thomas laughed, and the sound filled up some of the empty spaces in the smoky room. "We're all dying, Mrs. Sullivan. The question is what we do with the time we have left." Mary picked up the coins with trembling fingers. They felt warm, like they'd been sitting in sunshine instead of a dark tavern. "I don't understand why you're helping me." "Maybe you don't need to understand. Maybe you just need to let yourself be helped." The tavern door opened, bringing in a gust of cold air and 3 men who looked like trouble. They were loud and smelled like they'd been drinking for hours. One of them spotted Mary and nudged his friends. Well, what do we have here?" The biggest one swaggered over, his eyes moving between Mary and Thomas like he was figuring out a puzzle. "This is interesting." Thomas stood up slowly, and Mary noticed he was taller than she'd thought. "The lady and I were just finishing our conversation." "Were you now?" The drunk man grinned, showing missing teeth. "And what kind of conversation might that be?" Mary clutched the coins in her fist and stood up. "We should go." "Not so fast, sweetheart." The man moved to block her path. "Maybe you'd like to have a conversation with someone closer to your own age. Step aside." Thomas's voice changed, becoming hard as iron. "Or what, Grandpa?" What happened next surprised everyone, especially Mary. Thomas moved faster than she'd thought possible, grabbing the drunk man's wrist and twisting it in a way that made him yelp like a kicked dog. "The lady said we were leaving," Thomas said calmly, still holding the man's wrist. "I suggest you find somewhere else to drink tonight." The drunk man's friends started forward, but the bartender's voice boomed across the room. "That's enough. Take it outside or take it nowhere. Thomas released the man's wrist and offered Mary his arm. Shall we? They walked out together into the cold night air, Mary's heart still racing from what had just happened. Behind them, she could hear the drunk men arguing with each other about who was to blame. Thank you, she said once they were safely down the street. For the money or for the rescue? Both. Mary looked at him sideways as they walked. Where did you learn to do that thing with his wrist? Army, a long time ago. Thomas's voice sounded far away. Sometimes old lessons come in handy. They stopped at the corner where Mary needed to turn toward her boarding house. The streetlight cast long shadows on the muddy ground and Mary could see her breath in the cold air. Will I see you again? She asked, then immediately felt foolish for asking. Thomas considered this. Do you want to see me again? Mary surprised herself by nodding. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone mean. Someone who would make me feel small and dirty. She looked down at the coins still clutched in her hand. Someone who would take things from me instead of giving them. There are men like that, Thomas said quietly. But there are other kinds of men too. What kind are you? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching a carriage roll past in the muddy street. The kind who lost everything once and doesn't want to see it happen to someone else. Mary felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening that had been locked for a very long time. I should go. Emma will be wondering where I am. Of course. Thomas tipped his hat. Good night, Mrs. Sullivan. Good night, Mr. Whitmore. Mary walked home through the dark streets, the coins warm in her palm and her mind spinning with questions she didn't know how to answer. Behind her, she could hear Thomas's footsteps going in the opposite direction and she had to fight the urge to turn around and follow them. At the boarding house, she climbed the creaky stairs to her room where Emma lay sleeping in her makeshift crib. Her daughter's breathing was still rough and shallow, but tomorrow that would change. Tomorrow, Emma would have medicine. Mary sat on the edge of her narrow bed and opened her hand to look at the coins again. In the dim light from her single candle, they seemed to glow with possibility. But more than that, they represented something she'd almost forgotten existed, kindness without a price. For the first time in months, Mary Sullivan went to sleep with hope in her heart instead of fear. And outside her window, the Chicago wind carried the promise that sometimes, just sometimes, the world could surprise you in wonderful ways. Dr. Williams arrived so fast that Mary wondered if he'd been waiting around the corner for someone to need him. His black leather bag looked important as he climbed the narrow stairs to her room and Mary followed behind him like a worried shadow. Let me see the child, he said in his no-nonsense voice. Emma lay in her basket, breathing in short little puffs that made Mary's stomach twist with worry. The doctor listened to her chest with his strange metal instrument, then looked in her mouth and felt her tiny forehead. Pneumonia, just as I suspected. Dr. Williams reached into his bag and pulled out a small brown bottle. 3 drops of this medicine every 4 hours. No more, no less. Too much will make her sicker. Mary took the bottle with shaking hands. It was smaller than she'd expected for something that cost $2 whole. How long before she gets better? If we caught it early enough, she should improve within a week. The doctor packed his instruments back in his bag. Keep her warm and make sure she drinks plenty of water. After he left, Mary sat beside Emma's basket and carefully measured out 3 drops of the medicine onto a small spoon. Emma made a face at the bitter taste but swallowed it down like a good baby. There, Mary whispered, stroking her daughter's soft hair. That's going to make you all better. For the first time in weeks, Mary felt like she could breathe properly. Emma would live. The medicine would work. Everything was going to be fine. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Mary opened it to find Thomas Whitmore standing in the hallway holding a large basket covered with a clean white cloth. Mr. Whitmore, what are you doing here? I thought you might be hungry, he said simply. And I wanted to see how Emma was doing. Mary stared at the basket, then at him. You came all the way here just to bring food? Is that so strange? Actually, it was the strangest thing that had happened to Mary in a very long time. She stepped aside to let him in, suddenly aware of how small and shabby her room looked. The newspaper stuffed in the wall cracks seemed especially embarrassing. Thomas set the basket on her tiny table and pulled back the cloth. Mary's eyes widened. Fresh bread, yellow cheese, red apples, and a jar of golden honey. There was enough food to last for days. I can't accept all this, she said, even though her mouth was watering. Why not? Because. Mary struggled to find the right words. Because people don't do things like this for nothing. Thomas sat down on her one rickety chair, being careful not to make it creak too loudly. What if I told you I'm not doing it for nothing? Mary's heart sank. Here it comes, she thought. The real reason. The thing he wants in return. What if I told you, Thomas continued, that I'm doing it because it makes me feel useful again? Because for the first time in 2 years I have a reason to get out of bed in the morning. That wasn't what Mary had expected to hear. I don't understand. Thomas looked around her small room, taking in the cracked walls and the thin blanket on her bed. After my wife died, I stopped caring about anything. I have a big house, but it feels empty. I have money, but nothing worth spending it on. I have time, but nothing important to fill it with. Emma made a small sound from her basket and both adults looked over at her. She was sleeping more peacefully than she had in days. And then I met you, Thomas said quietly. A woman brave enough to do anything to save her child. A mother who would sacrifice everything for love. He paused. You reminded me that there are still things worth fighting for. Mary felt tears prick at her eyes. I'm not brave. I was terrified. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what needs to be done even when you are scared. Mary broke off a piece of the fresh bread and bit into it. The taste was so good it made her dizzy. When did you last eat something this fresh? She asked herself out loud. When did you last eat anything? Thomas asked gently. Mary's cheeks turned red. Yesterday. I had some soup Mrs. Henderson gave me. And before that? Mary couldn't remember. The days had started blending together when she'd stopped being able to afford regular meals. It doesn't matter. Emma needed food more than I did. Thomas shook his head. Emma needs her mother to be strong and healthy. You can't take care of her if you don't take care of yourself. I'm fine. Are you? Thomas looked at her carefully. When did you last sleep through the night? When did you last go a whole day without worrying about money? Mary couldn't answer either question. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt truly safe or truly rested. I have an idea, Thomas said. I walk through Lincoln Park most afternoons around 3 o'clock. The fresh air is good for thinking and there are benches where you could sit with Emma. If you ever want company, just company, nothing more, you'd be welcome to join me. Mary looked at him suspiciously. Just walking? Just talking. Just walking and talking. Thomas stood up, being careful not to disturb Emma. I know you don't trust easily, Mrs. Sullivan. You have good reasons not to. But sometimes people really do want to help without expecting anything in return. After he left, Mary sat at her table and ate more of the fresh bread with honey. The sweetness seemed to wake up parts of her that had been sleeping for months. She felt stronger already, more like herself. Emma stirred in her basket and opened her eyes. For the first time in days, they looked clear and bright instead of cloudy with fever. Hello, sweetheart, Mary whispered, picking up her daughter. Are you feeling better? Emma gurgled and reached for Mary's face with tiny fingers. Her skin felt cooler and her breathing was definitely easier. Mary held her close and walked to the small window that looked out over the alley. Below, she could see other people going about their business, washing clothes, carrying packages, talking to neighbors. Normal people living normal lives. Maybe she could have a normal life too. Maybe this nightmare of poverty and desperation was finally ending. Maybe Thomas Whitmore really was as kind as he seemed. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings. Things that seemed too good to be true usually were. Men who offered help without expecting payment usually wanted something else instead. And women like her, women who'd fallen so low they'd been willing to sell themselves, didn't get happy endings. Mary pushed those thoughts away and focused on Emma's warm weight in her arms. Tomorrow she would worry about what Thomas really wanted. Tomorrow she would figure out how to pay him back. Tonight she would just be grateful that her daughter was alive and getting better. Outside her window, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Mary made a wish on the brightest one, the same wish she'd been making for months. Please let Emma be safe. Please let Emma be happy. Please let Emma have a better life than mine. For the first time, she allowed herself to add one more line, and please, if it's not too much to ask, let me find some happiness too. The star twinkled as if it had heard her, and Mary smiled as she settled Emma back in her basket for the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new worries, new decisions to make. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, both she and her daughter would go to sleep with full bellies and medicine working to heal what was broken. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Mrs. Henderson's broom struck the boarding house steps like a judge's gavel, each sweep meant to clean away the shame Mary Sullivan had brought to her respectable establishment. The landlady's face twisted with disgust as she watched Mary pack her few belongings through the dirty window. Good riddance, Mrs. Henderson muttered, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. Some women just don't know their place in this world. Mary's hands shook as she folded Emma's tiny dresses into the worn carpet bag. 3 days had passed since Beatrice Morrison spotted her with Thomas in Lincoln Park. 3 days for whispers to spread through Chicago's tight-knit community like fire through dry wheat. 3 days for her world to crumble again. Emma gurgled happily from her basket, unaware that they were about to become homeless. The baby's innocent smile made Mary's heart ache. How could she explain to her daughter that being seen with a kind man was somehow worse than starving in the streets? A sharp knock rattled the thin door. Mary's stomach dropped, expecting Mrs. Henderson with more harsh words. Instead, she found Sarah Chin, the young Chinese woman who cleaned rooms on the first floor. "I brought you something," Sarah whispered, glancing nervously down the hallway. She pressed a small cloth bundle into Mary's hands. "Food for the journey." "And?" She hesitated. "There's talk in the kitchen." "Bad talk?" Mary's throat tightened. "What kind of talk?" "The ladies from the church came by this morning. They're saying that you and Mr. Whitmore are." Sarah's cheeks turned red. "They're planning to visit the Reverend. They want to make sure no decent family will hire you for work." The bundle of food suddenly felt heavy as a stone in Mary's hands. "Thank you for telling me." Sarah nodded and hurried away, her footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway like whispered secrets. Mary closed the door and leaned against it, fighting back tears. The church ladies weren't content to just gossip. They wanted to destroy any chance she had of building a new life. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson swept her front porch with unusual energy, her eyes constantly darting toward Mary's window. 2 doors down, Mrs. O'Brien stood in her garden, pretending to tend her roses while obviously listening for any sounds from the boarding house. Mary had become the neighborhood's morning entertainment. The sound of wagon wheels on cobblestones made her heart jump. Through the grimy window, she saw Thomas climbing down from his carriage, his face set with determination. Several women on the street stopped their morning chores to stare. "Look at him," Mrs. Patterson said loudly to Mrs. O'Brien. "Coming to collect his companion in broad daylight. No shame at all." Mary's cheeks burned. Thomas was risking his own reputation just by being here. She watched him walk up the boarding house steps, his back straight despite the stares and whispers following him. His knock was gentle but firm. "Mary? It's Thomas." She opened the door quickly, not wanting to give the neighborhood women more to discuss. "You shouldn't have come. People are watching." Thomas glanced at the women across the street, who immediately pretended to be busy with their chores. "Let them watch. Are you ready?" "Thomas, I can't go with you. It will only make things worse." Mary kept her voice low, aware that Mrs. Henderson was probably listening from somewhere nearby. "The church ladies are already planning to ruin my reputation completely. If I move into your house—" "Your reputation?" Thomas's eyebrows rose. "Mary, you're a mother who nearly sacrificed everything to save her child. That's the only reputation that matters." "Not in this world," Mary said sadly. "In this world, a woman alone with a man means only one thing. And once people believe that—" Emma started crying from her basket as if she could sense her mother's distress. Mary picked her up, rocking her gently. The baby's weight in her arms reminded her why none of this mattered. Emma needed safety. Emma needed food and warmth and medicine when she was sick. "Mrs. Sullivan!" A sharp voice called from the street. Mary looked out to see Reverend Mitchell approaching the boarding house, his black coat billowing behind him like storm clouds. Behind him walked 3 of the church ladies, including Beatrice Morrison, their faces set with righteous purpose. "This can't be good," Thomas muttered. Reverend Mitchell climbed the steps slowly, his pale eyes taking in every detail of the scene. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've come to speak with you about your situation." "What situation would that be, Reverend?" Mary asked, though she already knew. "Several concerned members of our congregation have brought troubling reports to my attention. Reports about your association with this gentleman." He nodded toward Thomas without looking at him directly. "As a woman without a husband's protection, you must be especially careful about appearances." Beatrice Morrison stepped forward, her smile sharp as winter wind. "We're only thinking of your welfare, Mary dear. And of course, your daughter's spiritual well-being." "Emma's spiritual well-being?" Mary felt anger starting to replace her fear. "Where was your concern for her spiritual well-being when she was dying of pneumonia? Where were you when we had no food, no warmth, no hope?" The Reverend's face darkened. "Mrs. Sullivan, your tone suggests a dangerous pride. Pride that prevents you from accepting proper guidance." "Proper guidance?" Thomas stepped forward, his voice carefully controlled. "Reverend, what guidance did your congregation offer when Mrs. Sullivan was facing eviction? When her child was sick. That's not the issue here, Reverend Mitchell replied stiffly. The issue is maintaining moral standards in our community. Mrs. O'Brien had crept closer during the conversation, and now she spoke up from the bottom of the steps. We all know what kind of arrangement this is. A decent woman doesn't accept charity from a man unless... Unless what? Mary's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Unless she's desperate enough to watch her child die? Unless she's hungry enough to consider choices that would horrify you comfortable ladies. The group fell silent, shocked by her directness. Mary looked at each of their faces, the Reverend's disapproval, Beatrice's satisfaction, Mrs. O'Brien's curiosity disguised as concern. You want to know the truth? Mary continued, her voice growing stronger. Yes, I was desperate. Yes, I considered selling myself to feed my daughter. And yes, when Mr. Whitmore offered help instead of other things, I accepted it gratefully. Beatrice gasped dramatically. Mary, such language. Such honesty, you mean? Mary shifted Emma to her other arm. You ladies sit in your comfortable parlors and judge women like me. But none of you have ever faced the choice between your child's life and your precious reputation. Reverend Mitchell's face had turned an uncomfortable shade of red. Mrs. Sullivan, if you persist in this rebellious attitude, I'm afraid the church cannot offer you any assistance or support. The church never offered me assistance before, Mary replied. Why would I expect it now? Thomas had been listening quietly, but now he stepped closer to Mary's side. Reverend, perhaps you could explain what assistance the church did offer Mrs. Sullivan when she was in need? That's not the point. The Reverend stammered. It seems very much the point to me, Thomas continued. You're here to condemn a woman for accepting help she desperately needed. But where were you when she needed it? Mrs. Patterson called out from across the street, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. Some help comes with a price, if you know what I mean. Mary felt her face burn with shame, but Thomas simply turned toward the woman with a calm smile. Mrs. Patterson, isn't it? I believe your husband was helped through his drinking problem by several members of our community. Did that help come with a price? Mrs. Patterson's mouth snapped shut like a trap. Emma had stopped crying and was now looking around at all the adults with wide, curious eyes. Her innocent gaze seemed to highlight the absurdity of the whole situation. Here they were, a group of grown people arguing about a mother's desperate choices while the child in question watched peacefully. This is getting us nowhere, Beatrice said, smoothing her expensive skirts. Mary, you have a choice to make. End this arrangement and return to proper society, or face the consequences of your actions. What consequences? Mary asked. No respectable employer will hire you. No decent boarding house will take you in. Your daughter will grow up marked by your shame. Beatrice's voice carried the satisfaction of someone delivering a final judgment. Mary looked down at Emma, then at Thomas, then back at the group of people who claimed to represent moral authority. The morning sun slanted across the boarding house steps, warming her face and giving her strength. My daughter will grow up knowing that her mother chose love over fear, Mary said quietly. She'll know that sometimes the right choice isn't the easy choice. And she'll know that true kindness doesn't come with conditions or judgments. Reverend Mitchell sighed heavily. I'm sorry to hear you say that, Mrs. Sullivan. I'm afraid you leave us no choice but to formally exclude you from our congregation. I excluded myself the moment I realized your congregation values reputation more than compassion, Mary replied. The Reverend and the ladies turned to leave, their mission apparently complete. But as they reached the street, Thomas called out to them. Reverend, one more question. The man in black turned back reluctantly. In your sermon last Sunday, didn't you speak about the Good Samaritan? About helping strangers in need without judgment? Reverend Mitchell's face grew even redder. That's entirely different. How? Thomas asked simply. But the Reverend had no answer. He turned and walked away, followed by his group of righteous women, leaving Mary and Thomas standing on the boarding house steps with Emma between them. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her face a mixture of relief and something that might have been regret. Well, that's that then. You'd better collect the rest of your things, Mrs. Sullivan. As Mary gathered the last of their belongings, she realized something had changed during the confrontation. The shame that had been weighing her down for weeks felt lighter somehow. Standing up to the Reverend and his followers hadn't solved her problems, but it had reminded her that her worth wasn't determined by their opinions. Thomas helped carry her bags to his carriage while half the neighborhood watched from their windows. As they settled Emma in the carriage seat, Mary felt a strange sense of freedom. Are you ready? Thomas asked, taking up the reins. Mary looked back at the boarding house, then at the faces in the windows, then at Emma's trusting eyes. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." But as the carriage pulled away from the curb, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were just beginning. The brass nameplate on the law office door read Aldrich and Associates in elegant script, but Mary felt anything but elegant as she climbed the narrow stairs behind Thomas. Emma fussed in her arms, somehow sensing her mother's nervousness about this mysterious appointment Thomas had arranged. "Why did you want to meet with a lawyer?" Mary asked for the third time that morning. Thomas paused on the landing, his hand on the polished doorknob. "Because sometimes protection requires more than good intentions, Mary. Sometimes it requires legal documents." The waiting room smelled of leather and expensive tobacco. Heavy law books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their gold-lettered spines creating an impressive but intimidating display. Mary had never been in a lawyer's office before. In her world, legal matters were usually bad news, evictions, debts, or worse. A secretary with perfectly arranged gray hair looked up from her desk. "Mr. Whitmore? Mr. Aldrich is ready for you." The lawyer's private office was even more impressive than the waiting room. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating a massive oak desk covered with neat stacks of papers. Behind the desk sat a thin man with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers. "Mrs. Sullivan, please sit down." Mr. Aldrich gestured to a comfortable chair across from his desk. "Mr. Whitmore has explained your situation to me." Mary shot a questioning look at Thomas, who was settling into the chair beside her. "What situation?" Mr. Aldrich opened a thick folder and pulled out several official-looking documents. "The threats against your reputation, for one thing. But more importantly, the legal vulnerability you face as an unmarried mother without financial resources." "I don't understand," Mary said, though a cold feeling was growing in her stomach. The lawyer leaned forward, his expression serious but gentle. "Mrs. Sullivan, are you aware that under current law, if someone were to challenge your fitness as a mother, you could lose custody of your daughter?" The words hit Mary like a physical blow. She clutched Emma tighter, causing the baby to squirm and whimper. "Lose custody? But she's my daughter." "The law doesn't always protect mothers who are deemed unsuitable by society's standards," Mr. Aldrich explained carefully. "A woman living alone, accepting charity from a man, facing moral condemnation from religious authorities, these things could be used against you." Thomas reached over and squeezed Mary's free hand. "That's why we're here, Mary. To make sure that never happens." "But who would challenge my fitness?" Mary asked, though even as she spoke, she remembered Beatrice Morrison's satisfied smile and the Reverend's threats. Mr. Aldrich consulted his notes. "Mr. Whitmore mentioned several women from your former congregation who have been quite vocal about their concerns. There's also the matter of your landlady's complaints about your conduct." Mary felt the walls of the office closing in around her. "What can I do?" "Several things," the lawyer replied, pulling out different documents. "First, we can establish Mr. Whitmore as Emma's legal guardian, which would provide financial security and social protection." "Guardian?" Mary's voice cracked. "You mean take her away from me?" No, Thomas said quickly. "Joint guardianship, Mary. Legal protection for both of you." Mr. Aldrich nodded. "It's unusual but not unprecedented. Mr. Whitmore would have legal standing to support you both, which would make any custody challenge much more difficult." Mary looked down at Emma, who had fallen asleep in her arms despite the tension in the room. Her daughter's face was peaceful, trusting, completely unaware that her future was being discussed by adults in suits. "There's another option," Mr. Aldrich continued carefully. "Marriage would provide the strongest legal protection." The word hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. Mary felt her cheeks burn. She and Thomas had never discussed marriage, though the thought had crossed her mind during their quiet evenings together. That's not why we're here," Mary stammered. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the papers scattered across the lawyer's desk. "Isn't it?" he asked finally. Before Mary could respond, a commotion erupted in the outer office. Loud voices, the sound of the secretary protesting, and then the door to Mr. Aldrich's office burst open. James Sullivan stood in the doorway, his travel-stained clothes and wild hair making him look like a man who had ridden hard for many miles. Behind him, the secretary wrung her hands apologetically. "I'm sorry, Mr. Aldrich." He wouldn't wait. "Hello, Mary," James said, his eyes taking in the scene before him, his wife, his daughter, his replacement, and a lawyer with custody papers spread across his desk. Mary's heart stopped. "James? How did you?" Word travels fast in a small world, James replied, stepping into the office uninvited. Heard my wife was living in sin with a rich man. Thought I'd come see for myself. Mr. Aldrich stood up slowly, his professional calm intact despite the dramatic interruption. Mr. Sullivan, I presume? This is a private meeting. Private meeting about my wife and my daughter? James laughed, but there was no humor in it. I don't think so. Thomas had also risen, positioning himself slightly between James and Mary. You gave up any claim to them when you left for California. Did I? James pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. Because according to the law, I'm still her husband. Still Emma's father. And I'm here to take them home. Mary found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Home? We don't have a home, James. You saw to that when you left. We have a home now, James said, his tone becoming almost gentle. I struck gold, Mary. Real gold. Enough to buy us a house, hire servants, live like proper people. He reached into another pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. When he opened it, the sunlight caught the gleam of gold nuggets inside. Look at this, James continued, his excitement growing. We're rich, Mary. All our problems are solved. Mary stared at the gold, remembering the months of hunger, the cold nights, Emma's fever. Part of her wanted to feel happiness at James's success. Instead, she felt only a deep, tired sadness. Where were you when Emma was dying? She asked quietly. James's enthusiasm faltered slightly. I was building our future. This future. He gestured toward the gold. She almost died, James. Pneumonia. I sat beside her bed for days, watching her struggle to breathe, not knowing if she would live or die. But she didn't die, James said, as if that solved everything. She's fine now. You're both fine. Emma stirred in Mary's arms, awakening to the sound of unfamiliar voices. When she saw James, she shrank back against her mother's shoulder, her small face scrunching up as if she might cry. She doesn't remember you, Mary said, the words carrying more weight than she had intended. James's face darkened. She's my daughter. She'll remember what she needs to remember. Mr. Aldrich cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should all sit down and discuss this calmly. Nothing to discuss, James said firmly. I'm taking my family home. What if they don't want to go? Thomas asked quietly. James turned to look at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. What if they don't want to? She's my wife, you fool. She goes where I say she goes. That's not how it works anymore, Mary said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. James stared at her. What did you say? I said that's not how it works anymore. Mary stood up, still holding Emma. I'm not the same woman you left behind, James. I can't be. Of course you can. We'll go back to how things were before. Before what? Before you left us with no money? Before I nearly lost our daughter? Before I learned what real kindness looks like. Mary's voice grew stronger with each word. James's face was turning red. Real kindness? From him. He jerked his head toward Thomas. Mary, you're being foolish. Whatever he's offered you, whatever he's promised you, it won't last. Men like him don't keep women like you. The insult hung in the air like a slap. Mary felt Emma tense in her arms, picking up on the hostile energy in the room. Thomas stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. Mr. Sullivan, I think you should leave. I'm not going anywhere without my wife and daughter, James replied. Then you're going to be here for a very long time, Mary said. James stared at her in disbelief. You're choosing him over me? Over your own husband? I'm choosing kindness over selfishness. I'm choosing someone who stayed over someone who left. I'm choosing love over possession. Love? James laughed bitterly. You think he loves you? Mary, look at yourself. Look at where you came from. You think a man like him could actually love damaged goods? The words were meant to hurt, and they did. Mary felt them like knife cuts, reopening wounds she thought had healed. But as she looked at Thomas's face, saw the pain there on her behalf, she realized something important. Maybe I am damaged, she said quietly. Maybe I'm not the woman I was before. But that doesn't mean I'm not worth loving. Emma chose that moment to reach out toward Thomas, her small hands grasping for the familiar comfort he represented. The gesture was simple, innocent, but it spoke volumes about where her trust lay. James saw it too, and his face crumpled slightly. She's my daughter, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Yes, Mary agreed. She is. But being someone's father means more than just biology, James. It means being there when you're needed. Mr. Aldrich had been watching the exchange with professional interest, but now he spoke up. Perhaps we should discuss the legal realities of this situation. Legal realities? James turned to him suspiciously. Under Illinois law, abandonment of family for more than 6 months constitutes grounds for divorce, the lawyer explained calmly. Mrs. Sullivan would have a strong case for dissolving the marriage and retaining custody of the child. James's confident expression began to waver. Abandonment? I was working, building a future. Without providing any support for your wife and child during that time, Mr. Aldrich continued. Without any communication about your whereabouts or intentions. The law is quite clear on this matter. Mary watched James's face as the reality of his situation sank in. The gold in his pouch might solve many problems, but it couldn't undo months of absence or erase the consequences of his choices. Mary, James said, his voice becoming pleading. We can start over. Fresh beginning. I know I made mistakes, but... You didn't make mistakes, James, Mary said sadly. You made choices. And now I'm making mine. Emma had begun to fuss again, overwhelmed by the tension and unfamiliar voices. Mary rocked her gently, humming a soft tune that seemed to calm both the baby and herself. What will it take? James asked suddenly. Everyone in the room looked at him. What do you mean? Mary asked. What will it take for you to come with me? Money? A bigger house? Servants? Name your price. The question revealed so much about how James saw the world, how he saw her. Everything had a price, everything could be bought, including love and loyalty. There's no price, James, Mary said. That's what you don't understand. Thomas had been quiet during most of the exchange, but now he stepped closer to Mary's side. Mr. Sullivan, your wife has made her choice clear. I think it's time you respected that. James looked around the room, at the lawyer with his divorce papers, at Thomas with his protective stance, at Mary with her quiet determination, at Emma reaching for anyone but him. This isn't over, he said finally. Yes, Mary said gently. It is. After James left, slamming the door behind him, the office felt strangely peaceful. Emma settled back into sleep, exhausted by the emotional upheaval she couldn't understand but had certainly felt. Well, Mr. Aldrich said, straightening his papers. That was illuminating. Mary sank back into her chair, suddenly feeling drained. What happens now? Now we proceed with the legal protections we discussed, the lawyer replied. Divorce papers, custody arrangements, and... He looked meaningfully between Mary and Thomas. Whatever other arrangements you might wish to make. Thomas reached over and took Mary's hand. We don't have to decide everything today, Mary. We have time. But as Mary looked down at Emma's sleeping face, she realized that time was exactly what they might not have. James had found them once, he could find them again. And next time, he might not come alone. The afternoon sun was shifting, casting longer shadows across the lawyer's office. Outside, Chicago continued its busy life, unaware that in one small room, a woman was choosing her future and her daughter's fate. Mary squeezed Thomas's hand and made her decision. A fist pounded against Thomas's front door like thunder on a quiet morning. Mary dropped the teacup she was washing and it shattered across the kitchen floor in 100 tiny pieces. Emma started crying from her high chair and something cold ran down Mary's spine like winter rain. I'll get it, Thomas called from the sitting room, but Mary was already moving. She knew that knock. She had heard it 1,000 times before, angry, demanding, and full of trouble. James Sullivan stood on the porch steps, his clothes dusty from travel and his eyes hard as river stones. He looked older than she remembered, with new lines around his mouth and a scar running down his left cheek. His hands were rough and dirty, and gold dust still clung to his fingernails. Hello, wife, he said, pushing past her into the house without waiting to be asked inside. Mary's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. James? You came back. Of course I came back. He looked around the fine hallway, taking in the polished wood floors and expensive paintings on the walls. His eyes narrowed when he saw how clean and well-dressed Mary looked. Though I see you didn't wait for me. Thomas appeared in the doorway, holding Emma in his arms. The baby had stopped crying and was staring at James with wide, curious eyes. She didn't know the strange man who smelled like horses and whiskey. You must be the husband, Thomas said quietly. James laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. I must be. Though I'm starting to wonder if I still have a wife. He walked closer to Thomas, and Mary could see the anger building in his shoulders. Nice house you have here. Must cost a lot to keep up. James, please, Mary stepped between them. Let me explain. Explain what? How you moved in with another man while I was working to build us a future. James's voice got louder with each word. How you let him play father to my daughter. Emma began to whimper at the raised voices. Thomas bounced her gently, his face calm but his eyes watchful. Perhaps we should sit down and discuss this like civilized people. Civilized? James spun around to face him. You steal a man's family and then talk to me about being civilized? Mary felt tears starting in her eyes. This was her worst fear coming true, the two men she cared about facing each other like enemies. Nobody stole anything? You left us, James. You walked away when things got hard. I left to find gold. To make money so we could have a better life. James pulled a small leather bag from his pocket and shook it. The sound of coins jingled through the room. And I found it. I came back rich, Mary. Rich enough to buy you anything you want. Thomas handed Emma to Mary and stepped forward. Money doesn't fix everything, Mr. Sullivan. Doesn't it? James's eyes glittered with anger and something else, something dangerous. Let's see how much you really care about my wife. I'll give you $500 to walk away. Right now. The room went quiet except for Emma's soft breathing. Mary stared at James, shocked that he would try to buy Thomas like a piece of property. But Thomas just shook his head. Mrs. Sullivan isn't for sale, he said simply. James's face turned red. Everything is for sale. Every person has a price. What's yours? 1,000? 2,000? James, stop it, Mary said. Her voice was shaking, but not with fear anymore. She was getting angry too. He's not going to take your money. Why not? He took everything else. James grabbed Mary's arm and she winced at his grip. You think he loves you? You think this is real? He's just playing house until he gets tired of you. Thomas's voice cut through the air like a knife. Let go of her. Now. Something in his tone made James release Mary's arm. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, and Mary could feel the violence hanging in the air like smoke. Then Emma started crying again, and the spell broke. Look what you've done, Mary said, rocking her daughter. You're scaring her. James's expression softened slightly when he looked at Emma. She's gotten big. She almost died, Mary said quietly. Last winter. Pneumonia. The doctor said another day and we would have lost her. For the first time since he'd arrived, James looked uncertain. I didn't know. How could you? You weren't here. Mary walked to the window and looked out at the garden where she and Emma played every morning. Do you know what it's like to watch your child struggle for every breath? To count every coin and know it's not enough? James shifted uncomfortably. I was trying to make things better. By leaving us alone and poor? Mary turned back to face him. I sold everything we owned, James. My wedding ring, my mother's jewelry, the furniture. I was ready to. She stopped, glancing at Thomas. Ready to what? James demanded. Mary lifted her chin. Ready to do whatever it took to save our daughter's life. The words hung in the air like an accusation. James looked from Mary to Thomas and back again, understanding dawning on his face. So that's how this started, he said slowly. You were selling yourself and he bought you. No, Thomas said firmly. That's not what happened. Isn't it? James pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited. My wife was desperate, you had money, and now she's living in your house. Seems pretty clear to me. Mary felt her cheeks burn with shame, but also with anger. You're wrong. Am I? Then tell me the truth, Mary. All of it. So she did. She told him about the terrible cold winter when Emma got sick. About selling everything they owned and still not having enough money for medicine. About the note she posted asking for work and how Mrs. Henderson told her about a man looking for companionship. I went to meet him, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was ready to do whatever he wanted. But Thomas didn't want that. He just gave me the money for Emma's medicine. No strings attached. James listened without interrupting, his face getting darker with each word. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. So you took charity from a stranger, he said finally. I took kindness from a friend, Mary replied. And then you moved in with him. We were about to be evicted. Thomas offered us a home. James stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. What kind of man lets his wife live with another man? What kind of woman accepts? The kind who puts her child's needs first, Thomas said quietly. And what about you? James whirled on him. What kind of man takes in another man's wife and child? What do you get out of this arrangement? Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. I get to remember what it feels like to matter to someone. To have a family again. Your family died, James said cruelly. This isn't your family. This is mine. Mary had heard enough. She handed Emma to Thomas and stepped directly in front of James. Emma and I are not your property. We're not things you can own or trade or sell. You're my wife. On paper, maybe. But when did you ever act like a husband? When did you ever put us first? Mary's voice grew stronger with each word. A real husband doesn't abandon his family when times get hard. A real husband doesn't try to buy his way back with gold dust and threats. James stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. You've changed. Yes, I have. I've learned that I deserve better than someone who only wants me when it's convenient. And you think he's better? James nodded toward Thomas. Mary looked at Thomas, who was gently rocking Emma and humming a soft lullaby. The baby had calmed down and was playing with his coat buttons, completely trusting and content. I think he's a good man who's been kind to us when we needed kindness most, she said. I think he's shown me what real love looks like. James's face twisted with rage and hurt. So that's it? You choose him over me? I choose happiness over misery. I choose respect over control. I choose someone who sees me as a person, not as property. For a moment, Mary thought James might hit her. His hands clenched into fists and his whole body trembled with anger. But then Emma laughed at something Thomas was doing and the sound seemed to deflate him. She doesn't even know me, he said quietly, looking at his daughter. She could, Mary said gently, if you wanted to be her father instead of just claiming to own her. James shook his head. It's too late for that. I can see it in your eyes, Mary. You've made your choice. He walked to the door, then stopped and turned back. I could make trouble for you. Both of you. A wife can't just leave her husband, not legally. I know, Mary said. But I won't, James continued. I've got enough gold to start over somewhere else. California, maybe, or Colorado. Somewhere nobody knows about the family I couldn't keep together. He looked at Emma one more time, then at Mary. Be happy, he said, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he sounded like the man she had once loved. Be happier than you ever were with me. After he left, Mary and Thomas stood in the hallway holding Emma between them. The house felt different somehow, lighter, as if a storm had passed and left clear skies behind. Are you all right? Thomas asked softly. Mary nodded, though tears were streaming down her face. I think I am. For the first time in a long time, I think I really am. 3 months after James left, Mary stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, smoothing down her best dress. It was blue silk with tiny white flowers, a gift from Thomas for her birthday. She had never owned anything so beautiful. Are you nervous? Thomas asked from the doorway. Mary turned to look at him. He was wearing his finest suit, the one he had worn to his first wife's funeral. But today was not about endings. Today was about beginnings. A little, she admitted. What if the judge says no? What if he thinks we're not proper? Thomas crossed the room and took her hands in his. Judge Morrison is a fair man. He'll see what I see, a woman who loves her daughter more than life itself and a man who wants to give them both a family. Mary nodded, but her stomach still felt full of butterflies. Today they were going to court to make everything official. Thomas wanted to adopt Emma and make Mary his wife in the eyes of the law. It should have been simple, but Mary knew that nothing in her life had ever been simple. What about what people will say? She asked. People will always find something to say, Thomas replied. The important thing is what we know to be true. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Patterson, their neighbor, peered in with a warm smile. The carriage is ready, she announced. And little Emma is all dressed and ready to go. Mary followed Thomas downstairs, where Emma was sitting on the parlor floor in her finest dress, white cotton with pink ribbons. She had grown so much in the past year, from a sick baby to a healthy, happy toddler who babbled constantly and got into everything. Mama! Emma reached up to be picked up and Mary scooped her into her arms. That's right, sweetheart. Mama and Papa are going to make sure we're always together. The courthouse was busier than Mary had expected. People hurried up and down the marble steps, carrying papers and talking in hushed voices. Judge Morrison's office was on the 3rd floor, and by the time they climbed all the stairs, Mary was breathing hard. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore? A clerk looked up from his desk. The judge will see you now. Actually, Mary said softly, it's still Miss Sullivan. That's what we're here to fix. Judge Morrison was older than Mary had expected, with white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His office smelled like leather books and pipe tobacco, and legal papers covered every surface of his desk. Please sit down, he said, gesturing to 2 chairs across from his desk. I've read your petition, Mr. Whitmore. This is somewhat unusual. Mary's heart sank. Unusual how? Well, Miss Sullivan, it's not every day that a single woman seeks to marry a man who wishes to adopt her child at the same time. Usually these things happen in a different order. Thomas leaned forward. Is that a problem, Your Honor? Judge Morrison smiled. Not a problem exactly. Just interesting. Tell me, Miss Sullivan, why do you want to marry Mr. Whitmore? The question caught Mary off guard. She had expected to be asked about her past, about James, about her fitness as a mother. She hadn't expected to be asked about love. Because he's a good man, she said finally. Because he's kinda Emma into me. Because he makes us feel safe and wanted. And you, Mr. Whitmore? Why do you want to marry Miss Sullivan and adopt her child? Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking at Emma, who was playing with a wooden toy on Mary's lap. Because they've brought joy back into my life, Your Honor. My first wife and I were never blessed with children. When Mary and Emma came into my home, it felt complete again. Judge Morrison made some notes on his papers. Miss Sullivan, I need to ask you about your first husband. Mr. James Sullivan. Where's he now? Mary's throat tightened. He left for California, Your Honor. He signed papers giving up all claim to Emma and to me. My lawyer has copies. Yes, I see that here. Judge Morrison shuffled through the documents. He accepted monetary compensation in exchange for agreeing to the divorce and giving up parental rights. That's also unusual. Is it wrong? Mary asked quietly. Not wrong exactly. But it does raise questions about his character and about the circumstances of your separation. Mary felt her cheeks burn. She knew what the judge was really asking. He wanted to know if she had been unfaithful, if Emma was really James's child, if there were secrets that might come back to cause trouble later. Your Honor, Thomas said firmly, Miss Sullivan has been nothing but honest and honorable in all her dealings. Whatever mistakes her first husband made, they were his alone. Judge Morrison studied them both for a long moment. Then he smiled. I can see that you care for each other genuinely. And Miss Emma certainly seems happy and healthy. As if she knew they were talking about her, Emma looked up at the judge and gave him her biggest smile. He chuckled and made funny faces at her until she giggled. Very well, he said, picking up his pen. I see no reason to deny your petition. Mr. Whitmore, you may marry Miss Sullivan, and the adoption papers for Emma will be finalized at the same time. Mary felt tears spring to her eyes. Really? Just like that? Just like that? Judge Morrison signed the papers with a flourish. Although I do have one condition. Mary's heart stopped. What condition? You must promise to be as happy as you look right now. Both of you. Thomas laughed and squeezed Mary's hand. I think we can manage that, Your Honor. The wedding ceremony was small and simple, held in the courthouse chapel with Mrs. Patterson and the clerk as witnesses. Mary wore her blue silk dress and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Thomas had picked that morning. Emma sat in the front row, clapping her hands every time someone said something. When the minister asked Thomas if he would take Mary as his wife, his voice was strong and clear. I will. When he asked Mary the same question, she looked into Thomas's kind eyes and thought about everything they had been through together. The cold winter nights when he had sat up with her while Emma was sick. The afternoon walks in the park when he had patiently taught Emma the names of different birds. The quiet evenings when they had talked about their dreams and fears. I will, she said, and meant it with every part of her heart. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Thomas kissed her gently while Emma squealed with delight and Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. After the ceremony, they went to a nice restaurant for dinner. Emma fell asleep in Mary's arms while Thomas told stories about his childhood that made Mary laugh until her sides hurt. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Mary felt truly, completely happy. That evening, as they put Emma to bed in her new nursery, the room Thomas had spent weeks painting and decorating, Mary realized how much her life had changed. A year ago, she had been desperate and alone, ready to sacrifice everything for her daughter's survival. Now she was part of a real family with a husband who loved her and a father for Emma who would never abandon them. Thank you, she whispered to Thomas as they stood watching Emma sleep. For what? For seeing something worth saving in us. For choosing love when you could have chosen anything else. Thomas put his arm around her and pulled her close. I didn't choose love, Mary. Love chose me. It chose both of us. As they walked back to their own room, their room now officially and forever, Mary thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. It hadn't been easy, and there had been times when she thought it might be impossible. But here they were, a family built not on obligation or desperation, but on genuine care and respect and love. Emma woke up crying just before midnight, and they both went to comfort her. Thomas rocked her while Mary sang a lullaby, and soon she was sleeping peacefully again. She's going to grow up knowing she's wanted, Mary said softly. Knowing she's loved by both of us. She's going to grow up strong and brave, just like her mother, Thomas replied. As they settled into bed together for the first time as husband and wife, Mary felt a peace she had never known before. Outside, the wind was gentle through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing the hour. Inside, their home was warm and safe and full of love. Mary had learned that sometimes the best things came from the worst circumstances. Sometimes people surprised you with their kindness when you expected only cruelty. Sometimes love really could conquer all the obstacles that seemed impossible to overcome. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, you could build a new life that was better than anything you had dared to dream.